What's up, everyone? It's Dakota, and welcome back to another Magic the Gathering video. And we are less than a week away from the Banned and Restricted announcement that is going to be taking place, and more than likely shaking up the Modern and Legacy format quite a bit. We don't really, at least I don't expect any changes to take place in Standard. I think the metagame is in a relatively healthy place, even if there's a lot of the decks towards the top that are seeing quite a bit of play. I think even some of the decks that aren't really getting as much love are pretty good in the format right now, and honestly beat up on some or most of those top tier decks. So I don't think there really needs to be any major drastic changes made to the standard format yet. Pioneer, I mean, I guess kind of whatever at this point, you know, with it being really not supported in the upcoming RCQ season for 2025 and 2026, you know, so we'll kind of monitor that. I'm sure there's some potential changes that could be made, but it just looks like Rakdos midrange is again kind of one of the best decks to be playing, you know, and just kind of take on a different kind of form than maybe what we're used to in years past. But nonetheless, Modern is going to be the big one. That is going to be the next format after this current round of standard RCQs that are going to end in March. So it's pretty important that we get the health of the format figured out before we actually get into that RCQ season, so we don't end up like last time where we were stuck with a Nadu format like post MH3, where we know that was just very clearly far and away the best thing to be doing in the format, and then going into the Boros Energy, you know, metagame where it slowly has just kind of overtaken the format and kind of gotten to the metagame share levels that the Rakdos scam decks had in that time, and maybe even more so because there was, you know, essentially a spin-off of the Boros Energy deck, and it was Mardu Energy, which is basically doing the same thing, except having some of the really good black cards to kind of help with some of the other bad matchups that have kind of rose to prominence because of Boros Energy. So you could argue that it's probably even more of a toxic metagame than something like the Nadu metagame and even the Rakdos scam meta that we had seen just a few years ago. But of course, we're going to be going into our own prediction of what the Modern format could potentially see banned. I think it's going to be pretty simple, but it's also fun to speculate on some cards. So that's exactly what we're going to do in this video, is kind of make some speculative guesses on cards that either could be banned this time around or maybe even the next time around when we come to the same kind of announcement. But of course, before we get too deep into the video and we talk about, you know, the possibility of what could be banned in our future banned and restricted announcement next week, if you're not subscribed to the channel and you want to see more videos from me where we post mainly about the Modern, Pioneer, and Standard format, as well as doing some other longer form videos. So if any of that interests you, please consider subscribing and ring that notification bell so you know when those videos get posted. It's a free, easy way to support me and my content. And if you'd like to go even further, I do have a few links in the description down below. One goes to my Discord server. You feel free to go and join over there, talk about Magic, all that fun stuff. On top of that, I also have a link to my Twitch channel, which I'm hopefully going to be streaming on a lot more often than we currently are. Obviously, we'll kind of explain some of that stuff later, but feel free to follow me over on Twitch, as well as checking out the sponsor of the channel, Manatraders. If you use my code in the description down below, you'll be able to get 5% off your monthly subscription fee, meaning that you are able to then kind of rent decks at will, you know, play essentially whatever decks you want without the commitment of actually buying those cards, and being able to participate in a free monthly tournament every month up until December, which is their invitational, and all of it's free essentially to enter, and you can win some pretty cool prizes if you end up doing very well. So thank you to Manatraders, and thank you all for watching, and let's go ahead and get into our banned restricted prediction. So probably as a surprise to nobody, the One Ring is on its long march off of the short bridge of being legal in the Modern format. It cannot be understated how powerful this card has been since day one. From essentially preview season, where this card was spoiled and nobody was really excited about it. I think at the time, understandably, you know, it's very easy to kind of write off expensive cards in Modern. Usually they have to have some form of cost reduction. That's why we see like Gerbag Anglers essentially as being like a 1 mana 5/5, even though it would cost 7 mana, was a huge deal because there was a way to reduce that cost. Same thing with Murktide Regent. There was a benefit to reducing that cost. And, you know, even Omnath had to do a lot of crazy things, you know, for 4 different colors of mana to be viable in the format. So really, how viable could a card like the One Ring be, where its immediate impact is giving you protection from everything if you cast it, having that restriction, and then of course getting to progressively draw more and more cards. And it turns out that that ended up being one of the best things that you can do in the format for a very long time. From just being a card that looks like it could have been a Karn target, where if you just need to get protection at a pinch and you're playing some kind of Eldrazi ramp deck or some kind of Tron deck, to just being essentially a 4 of, and really probably wrong if you're not playing 4 copies of this in your main deck, and it's just become easily one of the best cards that you could play in the Modern format. It turns out having protection from a turn is really nice, having your opponent kind of sit there with their creatures and their board and everything, and you have protection, you're going to end up losing a life, but you're going to end up seeing 4 or 5 extra cards potentially. And with some of the other things that decks have kind of adopted to be able to abuse this, where we would see players able to untap the ring and then tap it to draw even more cards, because you don't take the life until the beginning of your upkeep. And of course, just playing more copies of the ring to kind of reset it, control, being able to bounce it and replay it to reestablish the protection, and still, if they want to, like, again, draw increasingly more cards to kind of, fix some of the problems that a lot of these more low to the ground creature decks, or even some of the other like grindy decks where they want to be playing solitudes and force negations and subtleties and, things like that, where you can just kind of negate the cost of having to pitch additional cards to be able to deal with a specific spell, to then, the One Ring is just going to allow you to draw all those cards back and kind of minimize the impact of that cost. So for that reason, the One Ring is going to see a ban. It's easily the most played card in the format. It's the best card available to players in the format. For the longest time, it was super expensive. I think kind of priced some people out of playing the One Ring in the format, to now it's at a reasonable cost, but more than likely it is going to end up seeing the door. There is the potential that this could be restricted to 1 copy, and I think that there is a little bit more of an interesting build around deck-wise if you have your copy of the One Ring and you're able to, bounce it, reset the counters, something to that effect. But by and large, this card probably just shouldn't exist anyway. I think it would be very swingy in games where you see it. I mean, we've seen plenty of matches played where one person has the One Ring, the other person doesn't. Very often, the person that has the One Ring and is able to draw all those extra cards is very likely to kind of come ahead in those exchanges. So for that reason, the One Ring more than likely is going to see a ban in the Modern format. And again, it's probably for the best. Now, should there be more cards that are banned? Absolutely. There's a lot of powerful things in the Modern format that I don't think aren't necessarily healthy or just don't really add a whole lot to the format. So we're going to go over a few other options that I have where they could potentially see an exit with the One Ring, but at the very least, I would expect these cards to kind of be put on notice if the only change is the One Ring. And again, that's kind of what I would expect, just because we are used to kind of the minimal amount of changes affecting the format. So the One Ring probably, is the only thing that gets banned in this announcement, but I think there's a few other cards that you could potentially look at as being cards that are problematic and could end up seeing, essentially a banning in the format. As we all know, the Boros Energy decks have been probably the most dominant decks. They've seen a little bit of play when Nadu was legal. That seemed like to be one of the better decks, if not the best deck to kind of play against the Nadu decks. And now with Boros Energy absolutely taking over the format after Nadu had been banned, Guide of Souls is probably one of the best creatures in there. While I don't think it's the most attractive one to hit, we have Ocelot Pride and we have a Johnny. They're just 2 very powerful cards that can kind of snowball out of control. Guide of Souls snowballs in kind of a different way, where of course it is really good when you have all these other creatures kind of interacting with it. Like playing a Johnny on turn 2 is just going to give you 2 life and 2 energy, meaning that in certain cases you could, like, say, play an Aether Hub, get your first energy, play a Johnny, get your second and third, attack with a Guide of Souls. You have a 3/4 attacking on turn 2. You essentially have created a Delver with a lot more toughness and, again, a lot more utility, as long as it sits on the battlefield, giving the fact that you'll continue to gain more life, get more energy, and be able to spread out those counters and continue to be very aggressive with your creatures. That's just kind of what Guide of Souls offers. If you try to look at any other replacement where it's like any of the other Soul Sister cards like Soul's Attendant or even like Essence Warden, these cards just don't compare to what Guide of Souls offers. Having the extra point of toughness is really nice in a format where Bowmasters exist, where Ren and 6, a card that we've been kind of dumping on here for like the past few days, is a card that could have some prominence back in the format if Bowmasters were to get banned in any capacity or just not be playable in any amount. So the fact that this has a second point of toughness is really key in a lot of those factors, as well as, again, putting counters on those things that could potentially die to a Bowmaster, while, again, giving be kind of a payoff for playing more creatures. It isn't just more life, it's more energy, which is going to help you to cast some of your other energy payoffs, like Galvanic Discharge to kill potentially even bigger creatures, even kind of go to that energy total to where Guide of Souls can even sooner start putting counters on things. Again, you could even play a Galvanic Discharge and not spend any energy to deal any damage or anything, just so you could then activate Guide of Souls. How often does that come up? I'm not exactly sure, but I'm sure it's come up often enough to where that is a line of play that you could potentially take. It's just a card that does a lot for very little. It's a 1-mana card that is going to snowball out of control. It's going to make all of your creatures potential threats, and the more Ocelot Prides that you play and you're able to kind of activate, and the fact that Ocelot Pride can just trigger off of technically itself entering with a Guide of Souls in play, just means that the Guide of Souls probably needs to go. I think Ocelot Pride is definitely the more interesting of the 2 1-drops, so I would rather see Guide of Souls get banned than something like Ocelot Pride. But with that said, that's not the only energy payoff card that I think we need to be taking a look at when we go into this ban restricted announcement. So the other kind of energy payoff that I would like to at least be looked at is Amp Raptor. It's a 2-mana 2/1 first strike. It's not really a very menacing body and stats to kind of look at. Of course, it dies to a lot of the, Bowmasters and, again, potential Ren and 6 style abilities. Just ping something, totally fine. But Amped Raptor does something very special. That if you cast it from your hand, it'll enter the battlefield and give you 2 energy. It'll do that regardless. But if you cast it from your hand, you may exile cards from the top of your library to reveal a non-land card. Then you may cast that card by paying an amount of energy equal to its mana cost rather than paying its mana cost. So essentially, with Amped Raptor and in conjunction with something like a Guide of Souls, Amped Raptor can cast 4-drops on turn 2, and even if it's not casting a 4-drop on turn 2 and you just kind of build your deck to only play some really good 1s and 2s, Amped Raptor still offers a lot of value. It's getting you a free card for 2 mana, and to where even future Amped Raptors are going to be really good if you are able to play some of the good energy payoffs. And I think that energy could maybe even look at banning 2 separate cards. I think Guide of Souls is like a great place to start, but as far as like the other ones, because we have Galvanic Discharge that can generate a ton of energy, and a lot of the creatures you kill early on means you're going to have some energy left over, which means Amp Raptor, more than likely, if it does hit one, can cast a 3 or a 4-drop on turn 2, which is pretty obnoxious to deal with, all things considered. Of course, you're going to deplete your energy reserves, but when you're casting something like a 3-mana Planeswalker or even a 4-mana spell essentially for free, it's not fun. This is definitely not a fun play pattern. We've seen cards that have this sort of cascade effect be banned across multiple formats. We know that even with the Discovery mechanic, it ended up being too good for something like Pioneer, so the best Discover card ended up actually getting banned out of the format. We know that the Violent Outburst has been banned in Modern as well, just for being a card that abuses some of the 0-cost cards in the format. Could Amped Raptor see play in those kind of decks? Maybe if they can set it up a little bit. Potentially, that could happen. But overall, I don't necessarily... I don't even know if Amped Raptor can actually cast it. And I don't know. Aside from a maybe potentially confusing rules question, Amped Raptor does offer a lot of value, and by itself isn't necessarily very good. But then when you think about the Modern format, which has essentially been built on efficiency, there's a lot of really good 1 and 2 mana spells where even if it's not necessarily game breaking, kind of like the potential hits that you could see from the Boros Energy deck in its current state now, I just think that this kind of effect, it just shouldn't exist in the format. Like, you can kind of keep the more the others, like Sorcery Speed style, like cascade effects, like from Shardless Agent and from like Demonic Dread and things like that. I just think Amped Raptor, with the potential to go and cast a spell that costs more mana than the Amped Raptor with all the other energy payoffs, is probably just too good. So I think if you ended up getting rid of a lot of energy payoffs and you kind of limited Amped Raptor's ability to cast progressively higher costed cards by having to play more Amped Raptors, I think then that could be okay. But I think just as it stands, Amped Raptor is probably too good for Modern right now, with just the ability to be able to cast some pretty good spells for essentially no mana and get way far ahead on your opponent in the early turns, especially if you can do this on the play. This will be the last Boros card that we look at. This is essentially a card that isn't married to like the Boros energy archetype. You know, it definitely sees play in various different red-white based strategies, and overall it's just a very good card for the format. When again, just kind of like the One Ring, it was a card that was written off kind of in preview season where it'll probably be okay. You know, could it be the worst Titan, whatever the case may be. So Phlage is a 3-mana 6/6 that when it enters the battlefield you sacrifice unless it escapes, and when it enters the battlefield or attacks, then it deals 3 damage to any target and you gain 3 life. So essentially you get a Lightning Helix for 3 mana. First time you play it, get sacrificed, go to your graveyard, and you can escape it by paying 2 red, 2 white, and exiling 5 other cards from your graveyard, meaning that you can cast it from your graveyard for that cost, and then obviously you'll get the effect and it will not be sacrificed when it enters the battlefield. So very interesting here. Phlage is a very, very good card. Like we said, in the context of the format, it does kind of gain you a good amount of tempo. It's going to gain you life. It has some of the synergies with a lot of the other cards that you see in the Boros energy deck, specifically by having a creature enter the battlefield and then being able to sacrifice to something like a Goblin Bombardment before you actually sacrifice it to its own ability to be able to deal like 4 damage and deal up to like 4 damage to a particular target. So I think this card overall is just very good. It ends up being even better in the late game. We know that cards like Arena of Glory make Phlage even better for the fact that you're able to escape it with haste and be able to essentially deal 12 damage to your opponent potentially, if not being able to pick off 2 small creatures while also getting in for 6 and making it a lot harder for your opponent to actually block Phlage. Of course, also with Guided Souls being able to make this an 8/8 flyer, makes it even more impossible to block, and obviously getting in tons and tons of damage and wiping out over half your opponent's life total, potentially with just one swing without any other kind of buffs or anything like that. So I think Phlage is a really good card. I think it's one of the most powerful cards. I want to say it's the 3rd most played card currently in the Modern format, but I don't think it's a card that, you know, sees a ban this time around. I think it starts to get less likely to potentially see the ban list. I see it as just being a very good card. I'm interested to see kind of where this card sits in the metagame with Boros energy, you know, presumably being knocked down a peg or 2 with at least the banning of the One Ring. I think with the banning of the One Ring, this card does get slightly better for the fact that you can play it and just kind of go to the face in the late game where you want to bring this back and your opponent doesn't really, you know, you can't target your opponent with it and you don't really want to target anything else or really yourself. So I think that limiting the protection turns that your opponent has means that getting Phlage back ends up being a lot better, and having the ability to, again, kind of go to the face and then be able to get in massive amounts of damage on the turns where your opponent would potentially play the One Ring in kind of this post-ban world. So that's the last Boros card. I swear there's 2 more I want to go over because I think that they have been cards that, you know, recently have been very good and cards that have been good for a while in the format. So kind of sticking to the trend of Modern Horizons 3, because if you notice, like all of these cards have been printed in Modern Horizon 3, obviously minus the One Ring, but Ugin's Labyrinth is just, at its face, is a very powerful card. Now, we know that a lot of the Eldrazi kind of archetypes have plenty of 7 cost or higher colorless cards that do offer you some value. Devourer of Destiny is a huge one, which allows you to essentially dig for an Ugin's Labyrinth if your opening hand doesn't already have one, while also being a card that can go underneath the Ugin's Labyrinth to allow you to tap for 2 colorless mana, which is kind of the point of playing this card. Is when you play it, you know, you can imprint a 7 cost or greater colorless card from your hand underneath of it, and it'll tap for 2 mana instead of 1 if you have a card exiled with it, and you can get that card back by tapping the Ugin's Labyrinth and activating that ability. So in general, a lot of the like soul lands, as they call them, because they end up tapping for 2 lands, kind of getting the name from Soul Ring, that they usually have some kind of drawback. Ancient Tomb deals you 2 damage whenever you tap it for 2 colorless mana. City of Traders forces you to sacrifice another land. You know, if City Traders is in play and you play another land, you have to sack the City of Traders. Of course, still getting the mana, but kind of disincentivizing you from playing additional land drops because you want to have the ability of having 2 colorless mana. Eldrazi Temple taps for 2 colorless mana only to activate the abilities of Eldrazi's or to play Eldrazi spells. And of course, you know, Eye of Ugin just making your colorless Eldrazi spells cost 2 less to cast, and just other crazy things. You know, there's been some drawbacks to cards that allow you to have 2 mana, and this one, the only drawback is having a very high costed colorless card in your deck, and especially when you have a card like Devourer of Destiny that, you know, smooths out your draws a little bit to find Ugin's Labyrinth, and of course the fact that Ugin's Labyrinth does add 2 mana unconditionally to your mana pool, meaning that with what we've seen from a lot of the Eldrazi ramp decks, we just go like turn 1 Talisman into turn 2 Sowing Mycospawn to go and get another soul land to just kind of rock our opponent's world and, be casting, very, very high costed cards way earlier than we're really supposed to. And I think just on that merit alone, Ugin's Labyrinth should at least be on a watch list. With the One Ring gone, it does eliminate one of its best turn 2 plays with 4 mana, but still getting to ramp and put a decent sized creature in play with the potential to do the same thing again, but then stone raining your opponent as well as ramping yourself is probably not necessarily a fun play pattern. I think Ugin's Labyrinth probably shouldn't hang around the format, but I could be wrong. I don't like the fact that you can also get the card back. I think it would be really a bigger cost if you weren't actually able to get the card back, because very, very clearly you are able to kind of get around the drawback of this only adding 2 colorless mana, because then it'll add just 1 colorless mana once you return the card. So that's kind of my thoughts on Ugin's Labyrinth. We'll take a look at one more card and we'll wrap this all up. Very fitting that we started with the Lord of the Rings card. We should end with the Lord of the Rings card, and that is the One Ring's biggest nemesis, Orcish Bowmaster. So 2 mana, 1/1 with Phlage, that when it enters the battlefield or whenever an opponent draws a card, except for the first one they draw in each of their draw steps, Orcish Bowmaster deals 1 damage to any target, then you amass 1 orc. So essentially a 2 mana 1/1 that's going to ping something and it's going to make another body. This has been used in many different ways. Obviously, it's been used to hate out the One Ring, to where you can just end up making a pretty big orc army while pinging your opponent's board or pinging your opponent and putting even more pressure on them to draw some kind of answer to Orcish Bowmasters. These play very nicely in multiples. There is some ways that you can abuse the amass ability, to where, if you have multiple Bowmaster triggers, you end up making a token with one trigger, and then with the other trigger on the stack, you sacrifice the token, do something with it, and then you're able to amass another orc, and so on. Just kind of keep doing that thing. We've seen it abused in Yawgmoth decks and other black-based decks, just playing 4 copies of Bowmaster just because it is that good and it is that powerful. It's just, I don't know how good this card gets after the One Ring is banned, but it is a very annoying card. I think the fact that Wrenn and 6 nullified a lot of strategies that were playing like 1 toughness creatures, like we'd seen with Ragavan, that we'd seen with like Birds of Paradise, Noble Hierarch, makes it very hard to want to play those creatures that, aside from maybe Ragavan, are like fine to play a 1 mana dork, or should be okay to play a 1 mana dork in the format. And the fact that Bowmaster, just having the added benefit of being at instant speed, meaning that a lot of the other 1 toughness creatures that kind of hang out just end up getting sniped by a Bowmaster on your end step when maybe you already want to leave up mana anyway, so then be able to untap with the Bowmaster is potentially protected, or just leave up another copy of Bowmaster to potentially, ambush your opponent's creatures. And even that too, just getting to ambush them is pretty nuts. So Bowmaster itself just does a lot for very little, and you don't think it comes up, but then you're just not thinking and you end up drawing an extra card. The Bowmaster pings you get to make a 2/2, and then eventually like you've drawn a few extra cards, and now your opponent has a 5/5 creature on the battlefield that they essentially invested 2 mana into, and they've also gotten to deal 5 damage with the Bowmaster, which is a huge deal, when you're looking at a lot of the other decks in the format, and especially when you're looking at Boros Energy currently being one of the best decks in the format, and potentially being one of the better decks in the format kind of going on. So Bowmaster definitely probably has the eyes on it. I'm guessing that this card will not see a ban. If the One Ring is almost assuredly being banned, I'm sure that the consensus will kind of be that this card is okay-ish, as long as the One Ring doesn't get to stick around. But we could be proven wrong here in the next few months when Bowmaster ultimately is banned, maybe not on this particular list, but on the next one or the one after. And those are my thoughts, opinions, and predictions of the potential ban and restricted announcement here in December. It's going to be, I think, pretty basic overall, as the TLDR, at the very end of the video. I think it's going to be pretty basic. We're just going to probably see the One Ring banned, and then we're going to maybe on the outside chance that some card from Boros Energy gets banned, and we'll kind of see how the format shakes out, potentially getting another ban and restricted announcement before we actually go into the modern RCQ season. I think that would make the most sense to ensure that the format is as healthy as it can be going into that time period, and hopefully making very minimal changes, if not, if any, to hopefully ensure that players are happy with the format and the format is very healthy. I want to know in the comments down below what cards that you think potentially see the ban hammer. Do you think it's just going to be the One Ring? Do you think it's any of the cards that I listed here? Do you have any of your own cards, maybe some different thoughts on how to approach the ban and restricted list for the Modern format? Please let me know in the comments down below. Of course, subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed. Check out the links in the description down below. And with all that said, I hope you all enjoyed it, and I hope to see you all in the next one.